Welcome to the 10-minute breakdown. My name is Stan Jaraev, and I'm going to be breaking down and predicting every fight on the UFC Fight Night Hooker versus Poirier card coming up this weekend. And naturally, we're going to start with the main event first. We've got Dustin Poirier facing off with Dan Hooker. And at 31, Dustin Poirier is enjoying his prime with his last 5 fights being against Anthony Pettis, Justin Gaethje, Eddie Alvarez, Max Holloway, and then he ended up losing his last fight to Khabib Nurmagomedov. So every one of these guys is either holding or has held a UFC title in the recent past. Coming into this, his 33rd MMA bout, he's facing a rising contender in Dan Hooker. Poirier has a refined pressure and counter game that's backed up by his ability to grind out a round if he really needs to. And he's shown it time and again where in a 5-round bout, he will tough out those rough moments and then end up winning those later rounds. Dan Hooker trains at City Kickboxing with the likes of Israel Adesanya, Alexander Volkanovski. His last 5 wins are over Jim Miller, Gilbert Burns, James Vick, Ali Quinta, and Paul Felder. I mean, this is a list of who's who's when it comes to the contender and up-and-comers list. Most of them by first-round knockout, by the way. He brings a similar southpaw game as Poirier, but does not have the output of the same level of 5-round experience. He does have a height and reach advantage that should make up for some of that difference. Poirier is 8-2 against southpaws, whereas Dan Hooker's got a 1-1 record against left-handed fighters. Plus, we've seen Poirier in multiple 5-round wars. He's had many 5-round training camps, and we've seen him come back from tough moments to win later rounds time and again, whereas Hooker's really only had one 5-round fight, and that was his very last fight against Paul Felder. So I do favor Poirier here. I think just his proven track record in that situation, his output being significantly higher than Hooker's, but I have serious concern about Dan Hooker's kicks and knees. I think that very well could be the answer. Those kicks to the calf, those knees to the head, as Poirier kind of ducks under some of Dan Hooker's offensive boxing, I can see those weapons working really well against Poirier, so there's some concern in this pick for sure. Next up, we've got a matchup between Mike Perry and Mickey Gall. This one is particularly interesting because Mike Perry's been kind of losing to the very upper echelon, whereas Mickey Gall has been largely toiling in the mid-level of the UFC, where he has some wins and some losses. Mike Perry is must-watch when it comes to the UFC between his personality, his look, his fighting style. He's been making headlines lately by leaving his coaches behind and training under his college-aged girlfriend who has no MMA experience. In fact, she's going to corner him this weekend, apparently. He was riding a 2-fight losing streak into this bout, but he lost to top welterweight prospects Geoff Neal and Vicente Luque. He looked the part of a high-level welterweight in the Luque fight, but has struggled to get a streak going over the past 3 years. Mickey Gall made his name by beating up on CM Punk and Sage Northcutt. He tends to beat lower-level fighters, but loses to prospects, and even a weathered veteran in Diego Sanchez gave him a really, really rough time. He will be an athletic and an experience disparity in this matchup, but he should have the advantage on the ground, not to mention the height and reach. I'm going to roll the dice on Mike Perry, who's stronger, more explosive, more experienced at that upper echelon. It is risky, though, because Mickey Gall's clearly going to have the size advantage. He's going to have the better ground game, and the fact that Mickey Gall actually had a real training camp versus Mike Perry, who's been, hitting pads while his 5'2" girlfriend holds him, and he's got a couple of training partners who are about Mickey Gall's dimensions, but they've got a fight or two on their record. So I'm going with Mike Perry, but I think for all of these kind of outward reasons, the odds on this one are a little bit too far apart. Next up, we've got Kyle Dukas versus Brendan Allen. Brendan Allen has looked spectacular in the UFC thus far with finishes of Kevin Holland and Tom Breeze. I mean, these are really well-respected prospects, at least at some point in their careers. He trains at Rufus Sport, which generally produces solid kickboxers. He finishes his opponents using primarily his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's got a really good ground game, solid ground and pound, really good control. Kyle Dukas is making his UFC debut in this one. He's undefeated in 9 fights. 8 of them have come by submission. He's 6'3", but lacks the experience and the speed in the stand-up realm to really compete, I think, at this level of the UFC. So Allen should have the advantage everywhere here. He's like a legit UFC-level prospect going up against a regional-level prospect here. So I like Allen big. Next up, we've got Gian Villante versus Maurice Greene. Villante has been a mainstay at 205 after alternating wins and losses throughout his UFC career. He's making his heavyweight debut in this one. He's a social climber. In fact, he lists his best friend at Chris Weidman when Chris Weidman was champ, and then Stipe Miocic took that role once Chris went on a downslide. Kind of suspicious. If Stipe loses to Cormier in August, I expect he'll ingratiate himself to another champ that's in driving range of Long Island. Mostly kidding, of course. I'm sure he's a good dude. He's got a good rep as far as that goes. But he is missing a lot of things when it comes to his fighting style. He doesn't really have the gas tank. He doesn't anymore have quite the chin that he used to. His power is good, but he's not necessarily very fast. His footwork is really lacking. I don't think the guy's made improvements in a long time, actually. Maurice Greene is tall, talented, and athletic, but he's also green for high-level MMA. He'll try to shake off a 2-fight losing streak to Sergey Pavlovich and Alex Oleinik as he welcomes Villante to the heavyweight ranks. He trains at Factory X with Devontae Smith and James Krause, so good camp behind him in this one. Greene will have the size advantage and probably even technique in this one, even though he's kind of the greener fighter. So I like him to outwork Villante over 3 rounds, and I think it's very likely that Villante, not having to cut down to 205, will probably gas, best case, maybe midway through this fight. Next up, we've got Luis Pena versus Karma Worthy. Luis Pena made his debut through the Ultimate Fighter in the UFC ranks. He's 8-2 in MMA. Both losses are by split decision to fellow prospects. Standing at 6'3", he's tall for the weight class and has AKA, one of the elite camps in MMA, to sharpen his tools at. Karma Worthy made his UFC debut on short notice when he scored big with a KO and a huge upset over the highly touted Devontae Smith. Riding the momentum of his 6-fight winning streak, he hopes to make good in his second UFC showing as an underdog here. He's got a bit of a herky-jerky style as he throws calf kicks with both legs and waits for an opportunity to counter with his hands. He kind of goads his opponent into waiting in with boxing combos. I'm giving the edge to Pena here between having the higher level UFC experience, between having the wrestling background. He's a high school state wrestling champ, I believe. He's going to have the opportunity to get those takedowns, whereas Karma Worthy doesn't have the best takedown defense. I expect him to earn a decision here, largely dominant, but he's going to have a couple of hairy moments as they're standing up and he's looking for that takedown. In the matchup between Philip Lenz and Tanner Boser, we've got Tanner Boser, who's 1-1 in the UFC, coming off of a loss to super prospect Cyril Gane in a competitive firefight, honestly. Like, he probably had the best showing against Gane of anyone we've seen face him. He's a technical striker with a karate-based style who isn't known for being very exciting to watch. With a 17-6-1 record, he has a wealth of experience on the Canadian scene. Philip Lenz is a prospect out of Brazil who made his UFC debut against Andrei Arlovski in a competitive decision loss. Coming into this bout only 6 weeks later, the American top team fighter hopes to use his 18 fights of experience to edge Boser. Lenz is a technical striker, but he has low output. He's fairly quick but not explosive as he weighs about 230 pounds. He could make 205, I think, if he wanted to. I'm giving the edge to Boser here by a good margin. I think he's going to have the stand-up advantage. He's 6 years younger. He's got notably more experience, specifically in the UFC. I mean, he was able to at least score a win thus far, and his competitive loss was to a much higher level, I think, fighter with a much higher ceiling at this point in Cyril Gane over Andrei Arlovski. So I do favor him. I think his footwork is going to keep him out of takedown danger since Lenz is a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, but I like Boser in a big way here. Even though this is a pick'em fight, I'd say it's one worth investing on the betting window. Next, we've got Sean Woodson versus Julian Rosa. In this matchup, Sean Woodson made a successful UFC debut late last year after a knockout win on Contender Series. At 6'3", he's one of the tallest featherweights in the UFC and has a striking prowess to utilize his size advantage. He trains with James Krause and the crew at Glory MMA, so that is definitely to his credit. Julian Rosa is taking this fight on a few days' notice, filling in for Kyle Nelson. He's coming into his third UFC tenure, dating back to the Tough 22 season. He went 0-3 in his most recent UFC stint, but that's mostly because Sean Shelby doesn't like him. He matched him up with Devontae Smith, Grant Dawson, and Julio Arce, all serious prospects. After picking up a regional win, he's taking advantage of training at Extreme Couture in Vegas by taking the short notice opportunity at another UFC shot. He's a veteran at this point who has a pretty well-rounded game. He's got pretty good offensive striking, but doesn't have much in the way of defense. He'd rather look for submissions off his back than stand back up, so there are some glaring defensive holes for a guy that has some talent offensively. I favor Woodson here. He's the one with an actual training camp, and even though he isn't very fast, I expect that he'll have plenty of opportunities to land hard shots on Rosa. I wouldn't be surprised if this turns out to be Woodson's prospect loss, though, as Rosa has 4 times the experience of Sean Woodson. Next up, we've got Ramiz Brahimaj going up against Takashi Sato. Takashi Sato is 1-1 in the UFC after getting his experience in Pancrase. He knocked out Ben Saunders and lost by submission to Bilal, remember the name, Muhammad. He's a southpaw fighter with a solid left straight who trains with Hard Knocks 365 crew out in Florida under the tutelage of Henry Hooft. Ramiz Brahimaj is a Fortis MMA prospect who has scored every one of his wins by first or second round submission. He generally tends to overwhelm opponents before they're able to get into a flow. Even though he can crack with some power, he hasn't shown any depth to his stand-up game thus far. Ramiz has actually lost both of his fights that have gone past the second round on the regional level. And so for that reason alone, I favor Sato to kind of survive the early storm and then take over as the fight progresses. The risk is that Sato is a slow starter himself, and I could see Ramiz catching him early, catching him cold, and kind of surprising him with the submission, but I'm still going to stick with Sato on this one. It is very much a pick-em to me, though. Next, we've got Jordan Griffin going up against Youssef Zalal. Youssef Zalal looked very good in his UFC debut, where he outworked the previously undefeated Austin Lingo. His footwork allowed him to evade almost all the offense coming his way as he landed kicks and knees and takedowns basically at will. He trains with Factory X, which has been putting out some high-level MMA prospects over the past couple of years. Jordan Griffin is a crafty veteran who put his first UFC win on the ledger after going 0-2 against Dan Ige and Chaz Skelly. He's a fairly explosive southpaw fighting out of Rufus-Sport, really likes that cross-uppercut-cross combo. He has some deadly chokes with which he finished his last opponent, TJ Brown. I think Zalal should have better footwork, better striking, better wrestling in this matchup. The only risk he really has is getting caught by a choke as he kind of goes in for those double legs that he frequently likes to go for. I like him to survive that, though. I like him to work his way out of chokes that he's in and evade most of them predominantly, and I expect him to win a decision here over the crafty veteran. Thank you for watching. If you like what you saw, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and follow me at The Constant Martial Artist on Instagram and Stan Jurayev on Twitter. Thank you.